Simon Cowell, the man who turned sharp criticism into an art form and transformed ordinary singers into global stars, is now facing a reality more heartbreaking than anyone ever imagined. At 65, the empire he built is no longer what it once was. His body has been broken by terrifying accidents, and the fame that once defined him has become a shadow of its former glory. For decades, he was the kingmaker of television, a man feared and admired in equal measure, the ruthless face of shows that created millionaires overnight. But behind the confident smirk and cutting remarks lay a fragile truth, one that even Simon himself could no longer hide. From near-fatal injuries that left him fighting to walk again, to the collapse of his television dominance, to personal regrets that haunt him in private, the tragic fall of Simon Cowell is a story that reveals how quickly fortune can turn. This is not just the tale of a mogul's decline. It is the shocking truth of a man brought to his knees by life itself. Simon Philip Cowell was born on October 7, 1959, in Lambeth, London. And from the very beginning, his path was anything but simple. His father, Eric, worked as an executive at EMI Music Publishing, and his mother, Julie, was a ballet dancer and socialite. The Cowell household was comfortable, but far from glamorous. And young Simon grew up restless, often described as stubborn, rebellious, and unwilling to conform. School was not his strong suit. He clashed with teachers, struggled with authority, and dropped out before completing his formal education. Yet within this apparent failure was the early spark of a man who refused to play by the rules of others. He tried odd jobs, even working as a runner on film sets, but nothing satisfied him until he secured a mailroom position at EMI, the very company where his father had influence. It was here, starting at the bottom, that Simon absorbed everything about the music industry: the politics, the egos, the ruthless pursuit of profit. He wasn't content to shuffle papers. He studied how records were signed, marketed, and sold. He witnessed stars being made and destroyed, and quietly vowed to one day control the process himself. For years, he bounced between small record labels, often facing crushing setbacks. At one point, after a business collapse, he was forced to move back in with his parents, broke and humiliated. Friends recall that instead of giving up, he used the embarrassment as fuel, sharpening his hunger for power and recognition. He built a reputation for spotting talent no one else believed in, and for his uncanny ability to understand what ordinary people wanted to hear. That combination, vision and defiance, became his calling card. By his early 30s, Simon was carving a space for himself in an industry that devoured the weak. He had no patience for niceties, no interest in playing the polite executive. He wanted to be the man at the center, the one who could change lives with a single decision. This hunger was not about music alone. It was about control, revenge on those who doubted him, and a desperate need to prove he was more than a rebellious school dropout. This unshakable drive laid the foundation for the Simon Cowell persona the world would later come to know. Sharp-tongued, merciless, and unafraid to crush dreams in the name of discovering greatness. But as he climbed higher, the same ruthless edge that brought him success would also sow the seeds of his future heartbreak. By the late 1990s, Simon Cowell had transformed himself from a struggling record executive into a savvy businessman with a reputation for taking risks. He had already signed novelty acts like Robson and Jerome and the Power Rangers, proving he had a gift for turning unlikely performers into chart-topping sensations. But his greatest leap came when he recognized that the real stage for power wasn't just the recording studio, it was television. The world was changing, and Simon knew that music alone couldn't satisfy his ambition. He saw an opening in reality TV, a chance to combine his ruthless instincts with mass entertainment. That opportunity came with pop idol in the UK. Simon, with his razor-sharp wit and unapologetic cruelty, quickly became the breakout star. Audiences had never seen a judge so brutally honest, and while many loathed him, even more tuned in just to hear what he would say next. His critiques were cutting, often humiliating contestants, but viewers couldn't look away. For the first time, Simon wasn't just behind the scenes. He was the face of a cultural phenomenon. Riding that momentum, he carried the format across the Atlantic with American Idol, and the show exploded into one of the biggest television franchises in history. Simon became a household name in America, his voice and scowl instantly recognizable. Contestants feared him, audiences loved to hate him, and in just a few years, he went from obscure music executive to global celebrity. He wasn't just judging singers, he was reshaping pop culture itself. Careers like Kelly Clarkson and Carrie Underwood owed their starts to the platform he created, and the world began to view Simon as the ultimate gatekeeper of talent. The money followed quickly, with record sales, TV deals, and merchandise flooding in. But Simon's ambition didn't stop there. He expanded his empire with The X Factor and Got Talent, creating global franchises that spanned dozens of countries and pulled in billions of viewers. He was no longer just a judge. He was the architect of an entertainment machine that churned out stars and defined an entire era of television. Yet even at this height, whispers began to grow. Was his brand of cruelty destroying dreams as much as it was creating stars? Was Simon reveling too much in the pain of those who failed? Still, the public couldn't turn away, and his empire only grew stronger. Simon had finally achieved what he set out for as a young man: fame, power, and control. But the seeds of his future decline were already planted in the very empire he built. And the higher he climbed, the harder the fall would be when the cracks finally appeared. At the height of his fame, Simon Cowell was no longer just a television personality. He was an empire unto himself. By the mid-2000s, he was one of the highest-paid figures in entertainment, earning tens of millions each year and commanding global attention every time he appeared on screen. His sharp suits, trademark white shirts, and piercing glare became symbols of authority, and his scathing remarks were repeated in living rooms around the world. He was the man who could make or break a dream with a single sentence. The ultimate kingmaker of modern pop culture. At this peak, Simon cultivated an image that was both feared and admired. He positioned himself as the man who spoke the truth no one else dared to, and audiences believed it. His presence on American Idol turned auditions into a spectacle where his word mattered more than the voices themselves. Fans tuned in as much for his reactions as for the contestants, and he thrived on the attention, building his persona into something larger than life. He expanded with The X Factor and Britain's Got Talent, bringing names like One Direction, Leona Lewis, and Susan Boyle to the world stage. The press hailed him as a genius, a visionary who knew exactly how to package raw talent into global stardom. Yet behind the sharp tongue and the confident smirk, Simon's personal life was far more fragile than the image suggested. Friends described him as intensely private, often retreating into work because he struggled with loneliness. His relationships were turbulent, his bachelor lifestyle criticized as shallow, and whispers circulated that he had built walls so high around himself that no one could truly get close. He was a man surrounded by fame and wealth, yet often alone in quiet rooms, consumed by the empire he had built. Still, Simon pressed forward, determined to dominate every corner of television. At this time, his shows were pulling in record ratings, His production company, Psycho, was signing international stars, and he seemed untouchable. But even in this golden age, the cracks were beginning to show. Critics accused him of exploiting contestants for drama, of humiliating the vulnerable for entertainment, and of prioritizing spectacle over artistry. The same bluntness that made him famous was now drawing backlash, and though he shrugged it off publicly, privately, he knew the tide of public opinion could shift at any moment. His empire was built on controversy as much as talent, and while it fueled his rise, it also planted the seeds of his eventual decline. Simon Cowell at his peak had everything: money, power, and influence beyond measure. But behind the persona, the man was already beginning to unravel, setting the stage for the heartbreak that was yet to come. As the 2010s unfolded, Simon Cowell's once untouchable empire began to show its first signs of weakness. The ratings that had once made American Idol a global obsession started to decline, with critics pointing to the formula becoming stale and audiences growing tired of the cruelty that once felt refreshing but now seemed unnecessarily harsh. When Simon left American Idol in 2010 to focus on the X Factor USA, expectations were sky high. But the American version never reached the same cultural dominance he had envisioned, and after just 3 years, it was cancelled, a rare but significant defeat. In the UK, the X Factor also began to struggle, losing its dominance to newer shows and fresher formats. What had once been a cultural juggernaut was now increasingly accused of recycling drama, manipulating storylines, and using contestants more as disposable characters than genuine artists. The press began to question whether Simon's golden touch was fading. Behind the cameras, Simon was battling other struggles. He was aging in an industry that thrived on youth, his sharp image sometimes criticized as outdated, his relentless work ethic leaving little time for personal happiness. He had always defined himself by his work, but now that very work was under scrutiny, and for the first time the cracks were visible to the public. Former contestants spoke out about mistreatment, claiming they were pushed to emotional breaking points for the sake of ratings, while others alleged exploitative contracts and manipulation. Simon dismissed much of the criticism publicly, but it weighed on him privately. He began to sense that his empire was becoming a target rather than a triumph. The very brand of harsh honesty that made him a superstar was now being painted as cruelty. And his once loyal fan base was starting to fracture. The tabloids, once his allies, began publishing stories about his personal life with increasing bite, focusing on failed relationships, his bachelor image, and his reputation as a ruthless mogul. For a man who thrived on control, this loss of narrative was devastating. He had always believed that no matter what, he could dictate the direction of his career. But the first cracks revealed something more dangerous, that no empire, no matter how powerful, could withstand the shifting tides of public opinion forever. And while Simon tried to smile for the cameras, the cracks would only deepen, leading to tragedies that would push him to his breaking point. For all his power, wealth, and fame, Simon Cowell's greatest battles would come not from television ratings or public opinion, but from his own fragile body. In 2017, he suffered a frightening health scare when he fainted in his London home due to low blood pressure, leading doctors to warn him about his lifestyle. But the real tragedies came later, beginning in 2020, when a new passion of his turned nearly fatal. Simon had taken up electric bikes, finding thrill and escape in riding them around his estates. But in August of that year, everything changed. While testing a high-powered e-bike in the courtyard of his Malibu home, he lost control, crashed, and shattered his back in multiple places. In that instant, the man who had strutted across global stages with absolute confidence was left writhing in pain, barely able to move, fearing he might never walk again. Emergency surgery followed, with doctors inserting a metal rod into his spine, and for months Simon faced an agonizing recovery. The image of him, once untouchable, now dependent on others to help him stand, was a cruel reminder that no amount of fame could protect him from human fragility. He missed major shows, withdrew from the spotlight, and admitted privately that he had come dangerously close to being paralyzed for life. Just as he began to recover, tragedy struck again. In 2022, he suffered another crash, this time in London, breaking his arm and suffering a concussion. Friends described him as shaken, forced to confront his own mortality in a way he never had before. The man who once ruled the television world was now fighting to simply regain control of his body, haunted by the knowledge that his health could collapse at any moment. These accidents left lasting scars, not only physically, but emotionally. Simon confessed that the experiences changed his perspective on life, making him more aware of time, family, and the fragility of success. Yet, the world saw only the headlines. The once invincible Simon Cowell brought low by accidents that nearly ended his career and his life. For fans, it was shocking. For Simon, it was humbling. And though he tried to project strength, those closest to him knew the truth. He would never fully recover from the fear that his body, once a vessel of unstoppable ambition, had betrayed him. While Simon Cowell built his reputation on being cold, ruthless, and almost robotic in his pursuit of success, fatherhood exposed a side of him the world had rarely seen. In 2014, his partner Lauren Silverman gave birth to their son Eric. And, for the first time, Simon admitted publicly that his life had meaning beyond television ratings and record sales. He described Eric as his greatest achievement, a source of joy that softened the edges of his hardened image. Yet even this blessing came with complications. His relationship with Lauren was controversial from the start, rooted in scandal that played out in tabloid headlines and threatened to overshadow the happiness of becoming a father. Simon, who had always valued privacy, suddenly found his most intimate decisions becoming fuel for relentless media scrutiny. Despite the noise, he embraced fatherhood, often photographed doting on Eric and speaking about the ways it had changed him. He admitted that he finally understood love in a way he hadn't before, confessing that he wished he had started a family earlier. But beneath this newfound warmth lingered regret. For decades, he had devoted his energy to building empires, chasing ratings, and nurturing other people's dreams, while neglecting his own desire for a family. Now, at an age when many men are grandfathers, he was just beginning the journey of fatherhood, painfully aware of how much time had already slipped away. The accidents that nearly claimed his life deepened these emotions. Simon feared that his health struggles might rob Eric of a father too soon, and those close to him say he became more reflective, wrestling with guilt over the years lost to work and ambition. His identity, once defined entirely by sharp judgments and commanding boardrooms, was shifting into something more vulnerable. Yet vulnerability did not come easily for Simon. He struggled to reconcile his softer side with the ruthless persona the world demanded. Critics continued to attack him for being manipulative. Ratings for his shows continued to decline, and his sense of control wavered. In private, he leaned heavily on his family, relying on Lauren and Eric to remind him of what truly mattered. But in public, he tried to maintain the image of strength. The irony was cruel. The man who had once appeared untouchable was now most human when he least wanted the world to see it. Fatherhood gave Simon Cowell something to live for beyond fame, but it also forced him to confront regrets that could never be erased. Regrets that still haunt him as he faces the later years of his life. As the years rolled on, the once unshakable dominance of Simon Cowell's television empire began to fade into something unrecognizable. The ratings that once broke records for American Idol and The X Factor steadily declined, replaced by new formats, streaming platforms, and fresher faces that captured younger audiences. In the UK, The X Factor, once a cultural phenomenon, limped to its conclusion in 2018 after years of dwindling viewership and accusations that it had become formulaic and cruel. Even Britain's Got Talent, a show that had brought viral sensations like Susan Boyle into the spotlight, faced criticism for tired gimmicks and behind-the-scenes manipulation. In America, America's Got Talent still held an audience, but it no longer carried the same global weight it once did, and Simon himself seemed less the untouchable kingmaker and more a relic of an era that had passed. The empire he had built on controversy and spectacle was no longer invincible, and Simon struggled to adapt to a media landscape that had shifted under his feet. Streaming services like Netflix and YouTube created a world where anyone could find fame without facing his scathing judgment, and audiences grew weary of his brand of cruelty. Once hailed as the man who discovered stars, Simon now faced accusations that his shows destroyed more lives than they saved, with former contestants speaking out about exploitation, mental health struggles, and contracts that left them broken. The once admired mogul was now painted as the villain of a collapsing empire. Financially, he remained wealthy beyond imagination, but the power that had defined him was slipping. For a man who had lived his life controlling every detail, this loss was devastating. Behind the scenes, Simon reportedly became more withdrawn, relying heavily on family while quietly acknowledging that his grip on pop culture was gone. To the public, the transformation was startling. The Simon Cowell, who once dominated television screens worldwide, was now an aging figure trying to keep his place in an industry that had moved on. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all was that the man who had judged everyone else so harshly now found himself judged by time, relevance, and the very audience that had once hung on his every word. The empire was not destroyed in one dramatic collapse, but eroded slowly, painfully, year by year, until Simon Cowell was no longer the king of television, but a reminder of what once was. At 65, Simon Cowell sits at a crossroads that feels almost cruel in its irony. He is a man who has achieved everything the world defines as success: fame, unimaginable wealth, and a cultural legacy that reshaped modern entertainment. Yet the weight of it all now feels more like a burden than a triumph. Once the sharp-tongued judge who could make or break dreams with a single remark, he is now remembered as much for his personal tragedies, health struggles, and fading influence as he is for his empire of talent shows. His legacy is undeniable. He created platforms that gave the world stars like Kelly Clarkson, Carrie Underwood, One Direction, Leona Lewis, and Susan Boyle. Artists who might never have had a stage without him. For millions of viewers, his shows were a cultural ritual, a shared experience that defined an era of television. But legacies are complicated, and Simon's is stained with accusations of cruelty, manipulation, and exploitation. Former contestants have spoken out about the emotional toll of competing under his watch, while critics argue that his style of entertainment valued spectacle over artistry and pain over progress. In his younger years, Simon would have brushed off such criticism with a smirk, confident that ratings and profits justified everything. But in recent years, his near-death experiences and role as a father have made him more reflective. He admits to regrets, confessing that he wishes he had started a family earlier, that he had spent less time chasing power and more time nurturing personal happiness. These words strike differently, coming from a man once seen as untouchable, because they reveal the human being behind the carefully constructed persona. The health scares changed him permanently. After breaking his back in 2020, he spoke openly about how the accident gave him clarity. How lying in a hospital bed unsure if he would walk again forced him to consider what truly mattered. He now spends more time with his son, Eric, cherishing moments that once would have been sacrificed for another production meeting or recording contract. Yet even with this newfound perspective, the tragedies remain. His empire has crumbled in slow motion, his once dominant shows reduced to shadows of their former selves. His role in pop culture no longer the commanding force it once was. To many, Simon Cowell today is a symbol of how quickly fame fades and how even the most powerful figures cannot escape time's judgment. The man who built his identity on control has lost control of the one thing that matters most, the narrative of his life. And perhaps that is the true tragedy. For Simon, the cameras may still roll and the lights may still shine, but the world no longer hangs on his every word. He is living proof that wealth and fame cannot protect against regret, that even the king of talent can be humbled by life itself. And in this way, Simon Cowell's story becomes not just a tale of one man's rise and fall, but a warning to us all that the pursuit of power without balance leaves scars no empire can heal. The tragedy of Simon Cowell is not only what he lost, but what he never allowed himself to truly gain until it was too late. Peace, simplicity, and the knowledge that love, not power, is the only legacy that endures.